We're going through our series on Romans, and we're in Romans 1, the second half of Romans 1. It's definitely worth you turning to it. So do please switch on your Bible or open it if you have a print Bible with you. And we're going to be working through from verse 18 through to the end of the chapter. If you weren't here last week and you haven't picked up Tim's introduction to Romans and his talking about not being ashamed of the gospel, really fantastic. Please do go and pick it up off the website because it was a really great starter for the series. And now we're picking up off the back of where he got us to. I'm just going to give you 20 seconds more to find Romans 1 and then we'll dive in. So Paul's introduction to Romans talks about the good news, the evangelion of God, but he says, I'm not ashamed of it. It's the power of God for the salvation of everyone who will believe. And then, having said there's this wonderful good news, he actually dives straight into 3 chapters of bad news. And you might find yourself asking, what's going on here? Is this some kind of bait and switch setup? But actually, it really makes sense. And so just to explain why that is, I want to give you 2 pictures. And the first one is of Everest. I want you to imagine that you're helicoptered onto the summit of Everest. You might look around you and say, this is incredibly tall and impressive. You know, what a wonderful, impressive mountain this is. But if you start at base camp and you walk up the 11,000-foot climb from base camp up to the summit of Everest, then you really know it's tall. But actually, even base camp itself is at quite an altitude. And if somehow you could, dig a trench all the way down to sea level and then climb up from sea level to the summit of Everest, all 29,000 feet of it, then you would really know how tall Everest is. You would feel it in your bones. And this is one thing that Paul's doing here. He's taking us down to sea level, as it were, so that we can see how high God's grace is, how good his action towards us is. And he's sort of saying, if I show you what humanity's really like, you'll see just how amazing God's grace is. So that's one reason why he dives straight into bad news about humanity, because he wants to show us how good God's grace is. The second picture I want to give you is of a car MOT, something quite close to my heart, because we did have a van for a while that had extremely expensive MOTs. But I want you to imagine that you never took your car for an MOT, but just had the occasional thing looked at. Ignore the legal implications of that, but you might never know quite how unsafe your car was. And now imagine that a friend of yours who's a mechanic tries to convince you that you really should regularly take your car for an MOT. Perhaps the most effective way that they could convince you of that would be to do an MOT on your car and give you a list of all the failures. And once you saw that rundown of everything that was wrong, you'd realize that you really needed the fix. And this is another thing that Paul does in the next 3 chapters of Romans, is he shows us all the things that are wrong with humanity so that we realize our need for God. We realize that this isn't an optional extra. Faith is not something that, well, maybe it'll make your life a bit richer, but otherwise, if you're happy already, get on with life. He's saying, no, we as humans are so broken that we desperately need God. So keep those 2 pictures in your head as we go through a few chapters of what is essentially bad news, because there's a reason Paul's taking us down through all of the brokenness of humanity, and it's to lift God's grace high and to show us how much we need God. So we're going to work through the passage in three stages. The first one is the wrath of God, verse 18 to 20. I'll just read the passage. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what's been made, so that people are without excuse. Now, if I'd titled this sermon, The Wrath of God, it wouldn't have been very popular, and it's not a popular topic to talk about. I think partly that's because it's not well understood. But actually, the wrath of God is an important part of the nature of God. We need to come to terms with it. And I really like how the apologist Rabbi Zacharias explains the wrath of God. He says this: God has given us freedom of choice, but not freedom of consequence. In other words, he says to us, yes, I've given you the freedom to choose what you're going to do, but those choices come with consequences, and you don't get to choose the choice and not get the consequence. And the wrath of God partly works itself out in that way. So that there's two kinds of wrath of God, if you like. There's what I call natural wrath. That is something that God has baked into the fabric of the universe. I can tell you not to poke a hornet's nest. I can put signs up around the hornet's nest saying, do not poke the nest. I can give you lots of other good activities to do. But if you poke the nest, you are going to get stung. That's baked in to how God's made the world. And in the same way, some aspects of the wrath of God are baked into how he's made reality, how he's made this world, so that there is a consequence to certain sins, which just by nature of the world falls on us. But there's a second aspect to the wrath of God, and this is what God refers to as vengeance. God responds to wickedness and he punishes it. He is very slow to anger, and we're very, very grateful for that. That's one of the ways God introduces himself to Moses in Exodus 34. The Lord, the gracious and compassionate God. Next thing he says, slow to anger. So this is not a sort of a hot-tempered God responding in, knee-jerk reactions, but this is God's right response to wickedness. We see an example of just how slow God is to anger with the inhabitants of Canaan. Now, the people who lived in the land of Canaan at the time of Abraham did really unspeakable things, really, really horrible things. And if you want to do some reading about what was involved in their religious practices, and in particular how it related to children, then you can. But I recommend that you do it when you feel like you've got a strong stomach. God says this is unacceptable, and he says he will punish it. But he speaks to Abraham, and this is Genesis 15, and he says, your people, he's telling him what will happen. Your people will go and be slaves in Egypt, but after 4 generations they will return, because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now, Joseph is already 3 generations on from Abraham, and then there's another 4 generations in Egypt, and then God brings them back and they drive out the Canaanites. God's patience for these people is 7 generations at least before he finally says, no, I'm going to punish this wickedness and I'm going to drive these people out of their land. So God is, he says, vengeance is mine. God is a God who punishes wickedness. That's also in that Exodus 34 passage. He says, he doesn't leave the guilty unpunished. It's part of God's nature that he does punish wickedness. And this passage here says that God's wrath is being poured out on humanity because of all the wickedness and godlessness around us. And Paul goes a step further in what he says. He says it's not only that that's happening, he says we are knowingly bringing this on ourselves. Why? Because God has made some things evident from the universe around us. This doesn't mean that you can look at flowers and the sun rising and deduce the fullness of the gospel, Jesus coming to earth, being sacrificed for our sins, and so on. Paul's really clear on that elsewhere. He says, how will people know the gospel unless somebody brings it to them and preaches it to them? But what it does point to is God's divine attributes, his eternal nature, his power, are clear from the universe around us. As a few people have put it in different ways, I don't have enough faith to believe that all of this happened by chance. That's just crazy. We look at the universe around us, and the most logical thing from the beauty of the creation, from the craftsmanship involved, and from all of just the complexity of it and the delicate balance of it, the logical conclusion, if we don't have an invested need to say something else, is there is a divine creator power behind this. And so Paul says we know this, and yet we would rather suppress it. That's verses 18 to 20, the wrath of God. Paul then expands on this in 20 to 23, and I want to talk about here futile wisdom. So this is the passage. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile. and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. And this is our response, still visible today, that we are presented with the knowledge of God, at least that there is a God, just by looking around us, but we would rather have the lie. And our response is that we neither glorify God, and I'm talking here about humanity. I know, obviously, and we'll get to this in time, but I know that once we've been born again and once Christ has drawn us to himself, this changes. But our natural state is that we neither glorify God nor give him thanks. To put it in modern terms, we think I'm the best and I don't owe God anything. That's our response naturally. Knowing the truth, we would rather have the lie because the truth is inconvenient. I don't know if you remember that film that came out a while ago called An Inconvenient Truth. It was one of the first mainstream expositions of the climate change argument that was made. And it was called An Inconvenient Truth because there were a lot of people for whom the idea that our activity, particularly our burning of hydrocarbons, might be affecting the world climate, that meant they would have to change an awful lot, and that was deeply uncomfortable to them. And so it was an inconvenient truth to them. The same is true for a belief in God. It is deeply inconvenient if we're invested in a way of life that's built on there being no God. But the trouble is with this is that if we don't accept the very foundational truth of the universe, everything else becomes tainted by that. So he says their wisdom became futile. What does he mean? Well, Bertrand Russell, philosopher, once famously said, if you give me any false statement, I can use it to prove any other false statement. And in his lecture, somebody immediately said, okay, go on, let's try this. 1 = 2, prove that you're the Pope. And he says, okay, there's a room with 2 people in it, me and the Pope, but actually 2 = 1, so there's only 1 person in the room, therefore I'm the Pope. And he did that off the top of his head. But, you know, silly example, but the point is this: if right at the very basis of our beliefs, we have a wrong foundational belief, i.e. there is no God, everything else that we build on it becomes futile. I want you to imagine that you go to see a world's leading geographer talking about geographic processes, talking about, I don't know, formation of mountains or whatever it might be. And as you arrive, you're reading a news article and you find out that he is actually a flat earther. And he's one of these people who believes that the earth is actually flat. Whatever good and genuine expertise they might have about certain things, it's undermined because they're going to have to come up with ludicrous explanations for all these processes because they believe something fundamentally wrong about the world. And so our wisdom becomes futile if we start off with the idea that there is no God. Paul's next thing then is he says, in our futile wisdom, we prefer images to God. We prefer idols of wood and stone, animals, plants, people. And I wonder why this is, because this is getting to the heart of the passage. Why is it that we would rather have an idol than God? Why is it that we'd rather have a statue of a person with an elephant's head? Or why is it that we would rather, perhaps in our modern day, worship celebrities and live for a football club than we would have a God? I think there's 3 things that are going on here that point to something fundamental in our human nature, and I think this is a really important thing to take away from this passage. The first one is this: wood, stone, animals, even to an extent people, they're all controllable. If we have a God who's a dog or a giraffe or an elephant or whatever it might be, we know animals, we can hunt them, we can kill them, we can stuff one, we can carve a picture of one, and they're controllable. God is not controllable. In fact, he has sovereignty over us, and that's deeply uncomfortable to us. The idea that there's a God who is in no way affected by us choosing to try and change his will. That's deeply uncomfortable to us. He doesn't have to do anything because we try to make him. We can't force him. And people would rather have something that they have some control over, to a God who is sovereign. So it's important to remember these points because we're going to come to them in the next section. So we prefer things that are controllable to a sovereign God. The second is this: any idol that we build or we choose, we can also destroy or reject and be free of. You choose to support a football club, you dedicate your life to them, but at the end of the day, you can choose to support another club if you want. I know it's true because Elise's done it 3 times. I'm not dedicated his life to it, but changed clubs. And you can build an idol, and then if that idol doesn't give you fertile harvests, you can chuck it in a fire and pick a new god. We like the idea that we can fail, that we can not commit. We can reject or destroy something rather than have to stay committed to it. So we prefer gods that are controllable. We prefer gods that we can not commit to but walk away from or reject. And then the third one is this: God is not like us. Now, I know in some ways animals aren't like us, but they're much more like us than God in some respects, because we physically see their bodies and we can touch them and we can constantly, hear them and see them and so on. And so although we're made in the image of God, in our sort of fallen looking around us kind of way, actually there seems like there's more similarity with other people and animals, and we find it hard to reach for and uncomfortable to reach for the unseen God. There's a provocation to us to reach out for someone who is different, where we have to get our heads around the fact that he thinks in a different way from how we think. He has a different set of ideals from what we have. And that's uncomfortable. And we would rather have something that lives in the world that we relate to, where we think we understand what they think and how they relate and all that kind of thing. So we don't want to have to reach out for something unfamiliar. So we prefer gods that are controllable. We prefer gods that we can destroy or reject. We prefer gods that are in some way familiar to us and not other. And that's the nature of why we choose idols over what Paul says it is clear all around us, that there actually is a transcendent, sovereign God who has created us. Paul then says there's some serious consequences to this. And this is now the second half of the passage, point 3. And I'm just going to read this. As we read it, you'll see these will be some familiar verses to many of us, and you'll be aware that these verses are highly controversial in certain settings. I'm not going to dodge that. We're going to talk through the meaning of these and their implications. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women abandoned natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Just remember, in reading this, Paul's goal of showing us our true status, so that we see our desperate need of God, and so that we see how great God's grace is. He's not laying it on thick just for the sake of it, but there's a clear purpose in it. Okay, let's get to the passage. So the Bible uses different pictures to explain different aspects of our relationship with God. It's because our earthly versions are patterned after heavenly realities, and they serve as a reminder of them. So, for instance, God's discipline of us is expressed most commonly as his fatherhood. So our earthly fatherhood mirrors God's fatherhood and gives us a picture, an imperfect picture, of what God is like towards us as a father. His leading of us is often characterized as him being the shepherd, and particularly the closer we get to shepherding as it happened in the ancient Near East, the better we understand some of how God leads his people. Our thing is patterned after God's shepherding, and it serves as a reminder of it. His desire for us to worship him is most commonly expressed in images of a sexual relationship between a man and a woman, because many aspects of that relationship closely but imperfectly reflect worship. So abandonment to another person, desire, giving our whole selves to a different being, knowing and being known completely. Worship binds us to God, just as we read in Genesis that a man and wife become one flesh through sexual intercourse. So worship and a sexual relationship between a man and a woman are closely tied together. The one is born out of the other, and the one serves as a picture of the other, albeit imperfect, as always. And we read about this throughout Scripture, and particularly you'll find this in Isaiah, and Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and Hosea. God talks again and again of his faithfulness to Israel as being like a faithful husband to an unfaithful bride. And at times the language is almost uncomfortably graphic in how he describes that. So what happens to these patterns based on God's attributes when the source is cut off, when God is not acknowledged in them? Well, if we reject God as our father, our parenting and our discipline of our children becomes corrupt. It comes out as anger, or we abdicate responsibility and don't discipline them. Or we discipline them abusively, or we discipline them in wrong habits, because we've been cut off from God our Father and we don't acknowledge him, and we aren't constantly being renewed by his fatherhood for us. The way that we work it out is also corrupt. If we place idols in the place of God, our sexuality becomes corrupt. The ways in which we work out those relationships between men and women become corrupt because we've cut them off from the source, the true beauty of God's relationship with his people, and to put New Testament language on it, Christ and the church. Think about Revelation 21 and 22 and the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, coming down from heaven as a bride dressed for her husband. So I want to go back to those 3 points I made about why people prefer idols to God, and think about how these affect our sexuality. So idols are controllable, they're rejectable, and they're more familiar, they're more like us than the true God, in fallen ways of thinking at least. So instead of our sexuality mirroring the ideals found in worship, abandonment, knowing and being known, giving ourselves wholeheartedly to somebody else, being bound to somebody, we settle for sexuality that controls, that makes no absolute commitment, and that reaches for the familiar rather than embracing the challenge of difference. So controlling sexuality becomes abuse, objectification, and pornography. Uncommitted sexuality becomes promiscuity, infidelity, unmarried sex. Sexuality that reaches for the familiar is homosexuality. These are all ways in which Paul talks about our identity as sexual human beings becoming corrupt because of our inability to acknowledge God for who he is, and because of our placing of idols in place of God. I want to say 3 things that are really important about this particular passage, because I know that, as I say, it has been widely understood as a passage, widely misunderstood as a passage in 2 ways. Some people find the passage uncomfortable and just ignore it, And other people equally take it as a passage and say, great, we've got a passage to clobber people that we think live wrongly. And both of those are wrong uses of this passage. So 3 things that we need to read in here. The first is it's not only homosexuality that's in view in this passage. Any expression of sexuality other than celibate singleness or faithful heterosexual marriage is in view here. It mostly gets talked about in the conversation about whether or not it's okay for Christians to be in a same-sex relationship, but that is not the only thing it talks about in this passage. The second thing is this: Paul is explaining the results of godlessness, not the source of godlessness. The evil in all humanity is not this sin or that sin, it's our rejection of God. That's the source of evil in humanity. Everything else is secondary to that. And that's why we have to avoid the lazy mindset that can be found in the church, that he's a bad person because he's sleeping around, or she's a bad person because she's a lesbian. No, we're bad people because we reject God and live in a world that rejects God. But one of the results of that is that our sexuality is broken. And thirdly, I believe that all of us have broken sexuality to some degree or another. This passage is a leveler, not a reason to identify a group of people and clobber them. I think it's just some forms of brokenness are much more visible and obvious than others. So some people secretly view pornography. I think I've mentioned before the statistics within the church are really quite staggering. Or perhaps indulge in lustful thoughts about a co-worker. But that, it's not visible, people aren't going to notice that, but it's still brokenness in our sexuality. Other people commit to marriage but don't give themselves wholly to their partner. That's broken sexuality. Some people are repulsed by the idea of sex. Other people can't have enough. Broken sexuality. So yes, this passage is totally clear that homosexuality, in the sense of a sexual relationship between 2 people of the same gender, is wrong, but it's not a stick to beat people with. It's a description of the fallen state of mankind, and we all need saving from that. And while Paul's emphasis here is on how idolatry corrupts human sexuality, it's certainly not the only effect he lists. He goes into a whole list of other things that also come from our rejection of God and our placing of idols there. Alongside those sins that have had so much media attention, we also read that God rejectors disobey their parents. We read that they slander. We read that they gossip. Lastly, the lowest point of humanity he gets to in all of this is that despite knowing this stuff is wrong, we don't only do it, but we approve of others doing it. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Now, I don't know if like me, you struggle when you read those, because most of the people who I know who advocate for social liberality don't do it in the kind of way that this passage seems to imply. This passage seems to imply that people know it's wrong and sort of just go, well, even though it's wrong, I'm still going to not only do it myself, but approve of others doing it. And most of the people I know who advocate for social changes around these kind of questions don't seem to think it's wrong. In fact, quite the opposite. They can't conceive a world in which it is wrong. And so perhaps you struggle reading this passage in the same way that I have. I think what we need to do to understand it is perhaps put a slightly different picture on it. Can you imagine that you're giving an instruction to a child, and while you're giving them that instruction, they've got their fingers in their ears and they're going, la, 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 not listening, not listening. Now, they might not hear your actual instruction. And so when they go on and disobey it later, they don't think that they're disobeying that instruction, but they still know full well that they weren't listening to you and they're not living in obedience to you. And I think that's what this passage is drawing out. It goes back to this idea that our foundational belief, if we reject God, our foundational belief about life is disobedience, and it's flawed. Looking around us and seeing the world, the logical conclusion is there is a creator God who has divine power. And if we start by shelving that and saying, I won't have that, I'm in charge of my own life, which is the sin from Genesis 3 that started all of this. No, I would rather know good and evil for myself and make my own decisions. If that's our foundational belief, then what comes out of that is continued disobedience. Scripture's clear. God's divine nature is clear from creation, and we're without excuse. That's where this passage leaves us. I want to say two things in closing. One is this: there will be some for whom this passage hits closer to home than others. Perhaps it's your own friends and family, perhaps it's you. And not necessarily just the bits about homosexuality, but perhaps some of the other ways that I've talked about broken sexuality resonate with you, and you think, I don't think I've faced up to that. Or perhaps what I've said feels hurtful, and you think, I'm not sure I agree with this, I'm not sure I can cope with this. I'd like to encourage you to talk about it. I'm very open to having further conversations about this. I'd love to. If you feel that there's a difference in interpretation of the passage, if you feel that there's pastoral applications that I've not covered, I'd love to talk about it. I've spent a lot of time studying this particular topic for various reasons, and I'm confident in my interpretation of the scriptures. I'm confident that it's the way that the scriptures have largely been interpreted for 2,000 years, but I'm really happy to have conversations about that, and I'd welcome that, particularly if the alternative is just quietly disagreeing and sweeping it under the carpet. So please do raise conversations with myself, or if particularly if you're a woman and would rather speak to a woman about it, then please get in touch with Caroline and start that conversation. The second is this: the passage ends here, but I have to step beyond this. I can't leave us just thinking about sin and depravity, because that isn't where God has left us. It just happens to be where we're cutting the letter today. So I want to bring us back to that picture of Everest. Paul's idea of taking us down to sea level is so that we can see the glorious riches of God's grace. And I want to remind us that there is a summit. God has drawn close. In the midst of all of this, the scriptures say, while we were still enemies, Christ died for us. God has made a way, and he has put up with millennia of this rubbish behavior on our part. He's put up with it faithfully and patiently, because that's who he is. He is patient and he is faithful. So while the next couple of weeks we'll continue to look at the problem before moving on to the solution, I would like to close with that reminder: despite our fallen state, we have a great, loving God who is patient and who's faithful to us.